There's speculation that Canada and Mexico could join President Trump's tariffs on China. That might let them off the hook with tariffs, but will this actually happen? Welcome to China Uncensored, I'm Chris Chappell. It looks like the great Trump trade wars have begun. But before I get into that, real quick, thank you to the more than 5,000 of you who have signed this petition so far, telling Apple to not block our China Uncensored mobile app. As I said in previous episodes, we submitted our China Uncensored iOS app to Apple on January 24th. We were supposed to hear back with approval or rejection if they want us to make changes within about 5 business days. It's now been 40 days. No word from Apple. And a lot of people are concerned that Apple is soft censoring us by trying to simply ignore our application forever. The last time Apple censored us was in 2017, when they blocked the China Uncensored TV app from Taiwan and Hong Kong. We launched a petition and got nearly 10,000 signatures and some media attention, and then Apple suddenly unblocked our app, mysteriously and without any comment as to why. Surely it was some kind of technical error and not some intentional act of censorship related to their billions of dollars a year of revenue from China. Well, probably it's the same thing now, which is why it's so important that you sign this new petition to get us to 10,000 signatures. I'll put a link to the petition below. Now, back to the episode. Trump's tariffs on Canada and Mexico have gone into effect, and America's neighbors are not happy about it. But there still might be a way forward that doesn't involve all-out tariff retaliations. Because according to U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, Mexico has proposed matching U.S. tariffs on China. People are actually doing what I've been saying they should do for over a decade. My years of screaming into the void weren't meaningless. Now, this is a big deal because this isn't just some random pundit saying this. It's the U.S. Treasury Secretary. Historically, the Treasury has been the part of the executive branch that has embraced trade with China the most. But Bessent seems to be on board with Trump's trade war against China. In fact, besides just embracing Mexican tariffs on China, Bessent had another bright idea.
I do think one very interesting proposal that the Mexican government has made is perhaps matching the U.S. On our China tariffs. I think it would be a nice gesture if the Canadians did it also. So in a way, we could have Fortress North America from the flood of Chinese imports that's coming out of the most unbalanced economy in the history of modern times.
So Bessent is on board. But how real is this proposal for Mexico? I mean, just because Bessent says it's there doesn't make it necessarily true. There are others, however. A Bloomberg report, citing anonymous people familiar with the matter, said that Mexican officials were willing to raise tariffs on Chinese goods and find ways to buy more from the U.S. in a bid to avoid duties threatened by President Donald Trump. Meanwhile, another anonymous official told Bloomberg that Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum had been planning to make this offer part of ongoing trade talks with the Trump administration. Of course, the fact that these sources are speaking anonymously means the proposal isn't anywhere near being a done deal. Unless they just like speaking in shadows with a voice modulator, it does seem fun. Not to mention that Canada hasn't made a similar proposal so far or even commented on this report. But still, there seems to be something to this proposal. There's just one problem. Both Mexico and Canada have pretty deep economic ties to China. And when push comes to shove, they may not be willing or able to decouple. Let's start with Mexico. Over the last few years, Chinese companies have massively expanded their presence in Mexico, with many of them seeing the country as a gateway to the enormous North American market. Take, for example, the Hofusan Industrial Park in Nuevo León, which hosts over 30 Chinese state-owned companies right on the Texas border. But I'm sure that's just a coincidence, like how it's a coincidence China loves buying farmland around U.S. military bases. Such silly coincidences. The plant allows for repackaging in order to avoid or limit U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods. Projects like these provide many jobs for Mexicans, but also undermine their own domestic industry, which is a feature, not a bug. That's not all. Over the past 10 years, Chinese exports to Mexico have been steadily growing, reaching more than $80 billion worth in 2023. In addition, according to America's Quarterly, Chinese foreign direct investment, or FDI, in Mexico has grown at an average rate of 50% since 2018. But those are just the reported numbers, with some analysts, like the Rhodium Group, estimating that the real FDI figure is far higher. For example, a report in the Rhodium Group's China Cross-Border Monitor concludes that the Chinese FDI in Mexico is as much as 6 times higher than the official stock figures, reflecting well-known gaps and distortions in the FDI data. Further complicating the data's transparency is that some of these investments come through offshore hubs, like Hong Kong. There are also the shady figures related to Chinese loans and investments in Mexican infrastructure projects, which, by and large, aren't totally available to the public, something that also makes those official FDI figures look suspicious. For example, the China Construction Bank has increasingly made inroads into strategic sectors in the country, such as aviation and infrastructure, because that's exactly what you want stamped on your airplanes, made in China. Further, China Communications Construction Company Limited, or CCCC, a state-owned enterprise blacklisted by the World Bank for fraudulent practices, secured a contract for Mexico's flagship infrastructure project, the Mayan Train, yet its investment does not appear in official records. But wait, there's more. China's Railway Construction Corporation, or CRCC, is also involved in a light rail system in Mexico City, while other Chinese state-owned enterprises are becoming heavily involved in other critical transport infrastructure too, such as metro upgrades in Mexico City and Monterrey. Also, 2 of Mexico's 3 major airlines lease aircraft through CDB Aviation, an Irish subsidiary wholly owned by China Development Bank Financial Leasing Company. The Chinese Communist Party has also made other kinds of huge inroads into the Mexican economy. Around 1/5 of new cars sold in Mexico are Chinese in origin, with the number of Chinese cars in Mexico growing steadily. So you're telling me their planes, trains, and automobiles are all made in China? It's more of a recipe for disaster than pairing Steve Martin with John Candy. In fact, according to the Mexican Secretary of the Economy, as of 2023, China became the largest supplier of cars to Mexico, surpassing the United States. According to Michael Dune of the Center for Automotive Research, Mexico decided 5 years ago to open its door wide for Chinese car imports. Back then, a decree dropped import tariffs on cars from 20% to 0%. The idea was to give some Mexican car buyers access to low-cost EVs. It's not just exports from China either. Back in 2017, Chinese automaker BAIC even opened a manufacturing plant in the Mexican city of Veracruz. Then there's the digital economy. 10 firms identified by the American Department of Defense as being linked to the Chinese military are active in Mexico. These include Huawei, Dahua, and Hikvision. Huawei has entrenched itself as a key player in the nation's telecommunications sector, while Dahua and Hikvision supply surveillance equipment, including for public security, in border states like Chihuahua and Coahuila. Given that this is just right across the U.S. border and the U.S. has banned these firms, this is an enormous security risk. Luckily, it's probably nothing to be concerned about, as it's just another one of those coincidences, that easily recognizable pattern of coincidences. So when it comes to China, Mexico is pretty compromised. But what about Canada? Well, for one, Beijing says it's willing to deepen economic ties with Canada due to the U.S. tariffs. They're like a creepy dude sliding into a girl's DMs the second he sees she's having relationship troubles. That might have something to do with a relative decline in trade recently between China and Canada, especially since Canada aligned itself with the EU and the US when it came to putting tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. But the CCP still holds serious sway in Canada through other means. For example, Canadian financial institutions such as banks, insurance companies, and pension funds are heavily invested in China. Meanwhile, according to China Briefing, the CCP is allowing Canadian medical institutions to set up hospitals in China in certain cities, so they can directly compete in China's healthcare services market. Those hospitals are really giving China a taste of their own medicine. Then there's Chinese interference in Canadian politics, which I've covered extensively. A series of reports in both the Global News and the Globe and Mail newspapers revealed that intelligence officials in Canada found a series of CCP-linked interference operations carried out via its consulates in Canada. One case involved a secret funding campaign through the Chinese Toronto consulate to 11 candidates running in the 2019 federal election. In another instance, Canada's Liberal Party was warned that one of their candidates might have been compromised by China. The person in question was Han Dong, at that point a former Ontario MPP. CSIS, or the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, had intelligence that the CCP preferred Han to MP Gung Tan, who was seen as disappointing to Beijing. Man, it always hurts when they're not angry, but just disappointed. Canadian intelligence began tracking Han in June of that year, although he eventually left the Liberal caucus under pressure while vowing to fight the claims. Even other Canadian politicians have raised concerns.
There are questions that need to be answered. What precipitated his departure? What did he allegedly do, irrespective of his voting record on China? And I can tell you for a fact that I have never had Toronto's Chinese Consul General on my speed dial, but can others say the same?
Even the current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, was urged to rescind his candidacy due to findings that he frequently contacted Chinese officials in Ontario and was considered a close friend of the Chinese Toronto consulate. But Prime Minister Trudeau offered his support to Han and didn't comment for a long time on the case, merely saying he served his community well during the pandemic and stood up against anti-Asian bigotry. Like saying, hey, maybe the Wuhan coronavirus came from the coronavirus lab in Wuhan. Such bigotry. In yet another case in 2021, Chinese Communist Party diplomats and their proxies made undeclared cash donations to political campaigns, while also hiring international students from China to serve as full-time volunteers for some political campaigns. And finally, also in 2021, the head of CSIS told MP Michael Chong that he and his family were being targeted by the CCP in Canada. That would be because he sponsored a parliamentary motion accusing China of human rights violations, which is obvious to anyone with eyes that weren't forcibly harvested by the CCP. What this tells us is that the CCP has plenty of reach and influence in Canada, at least according to the Canadian intelligence services. But Canadians shouldn't worry because the not at all compromised Prime Minister's office has said there have been contradictions or inaccuracies in these reports from the intelligence service. So both Canada and Mexico have serious interests in pursuing a relationship with China, or at least reasons to not run away from Beijing. What does that mean for Fortress North America? Instead of a moat, is it going to have a cozy back entrance for China to saunter in and out of? Well, both countries have and likely will take some steps to appease the White House when it comes to China. For example, Mexico is suddenly getting cold feet about letting China build a new EV plant in its country since Trump won the election. And if Canada and Mexico do wish to strike some kind of deal with the U.S. on avoiding tariffs, a tariff alliance against China could, in theory, be a good option. There's a reason Claudia Sheinbaum floated the idea. But the thing is, this kind of plan could take a long time to put together. And in any case, it doesn't look like these trade tensions are calming down very soon. Besides, Canada is looking pretty compromised by Chinese influence operation. It has a lot of investment in China that it doesn't want to lose. And Mexico's economy has been boosted by both Chinese exports and investment in infrastructure and manufacturing. It seems likely that for now, both Canada and Mexico have too much at stake to risk going against China. But the Orange Man is an unusual president, and stranger things have happened. But you know what's also strange? Apple, which just so happens to rely on the China market for more than $50 billion in revenue per year, is refusing to process the China Uncensored app we submitted nearly 6 weeks ago. So click below and sign this petition to tell Apple to not censor the China Uncensored app. Remember, we need at least 10,000 signatures, so don't wait. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. Click below.